This episode is sponsored by Lendlord. Lendlord is an online platform designed to help landlords and property investors manage, track, and optimize their real estate investments. Lendlord has a whole suite of free services, including a deal analyzer, property flipping calculator, tenant CRM, profit and loss reports, and so much more. I personally use Lendlord to track all my rental properties. Think of it as a modern day upgrade to boring old spreadsheets. Lendlord also has useful tools to analyze real estate deals, allowing you to calculate cap rates, IRR, and annual cash flows. It's completely free, so check out the link in the description below and let me know what you think. Hey, Saretsky here. Welcome back to the show. Debated not doing a show here this week, given Easter long weekend. I'm currently away right now in Calgary, here finishing up my construction project. As you guys know, I've been working on a fourplex here. And so that's just finishing up construction. And so, I wanted to get into this week's show because I figured it was a pretty important announcement from the BC government and what we're seeing actually as well from the Toronto government around some very, very significant changes around zoning. And, I think that we can argue that when you have 1 million people coming to this country without an actual housing supply plan, you run into basically a prolonged housing crisis. And I think that's what we're mirrored in. And so the governments are now starting to figure out that, okay, we need to fix the zoning issue. So the federal government sets the immigration targets, but there's really no dialogue. They basically just pass the buck onto the provincial and municipal governments. And of course, it's the municipal governments that are responsible for approving housing supply. And I can tell you factually that in Greater Vancouver, it takes many, many years to get projects approved. And this is extremely costly. You've got holding costs, you've got permitting costs, etc., that become extremely burdensome and ultimately have to get passed through to the end user and factored into your pro forma. And so the government is finally starting to figure out that, okay, these municipal governments, which run on these 4-year election cycles, are basically incentivized to do whatever it takes to get them in power. And the reality is a lot of people, particularly wealthy individuals, don't want rezoning happening in their neighborhoods because they want to preserve their asset. They want to preserve the neighborhood that they've bought into and they've lived in for the last 30 years. So they don't want new density coming into the neighborhood. And so the municipal governments have basically been very reluctant to actually approve new construction and new housing supply. So the BC government has come out and announced that they are going to, coming this fall with new legislation, to override municipal zoning and basically allow single-family zoning to allow new townhouse developments, duplexes, triplexes, and potentially even row homes to basically supersede, again, the municipal zoning bylaws to say that on single-family houses, you must and you will approve this multi-family density. And basically what we call it in the development industry is ground-oriented housing. So this is basically housing that I would say is in the most need. The clients that I deal with on a day-to-day basis where we're seeing the most pressure in the housing market is young families. Think about it. Millennials are coming up now. They're starting to have families. Their families are starting to grow. And they need 3-bedroom homes in order to support these families. And I would say it's actually a large reason that people are not having children and starting families later in life is because they don't have their housing situation figured out. The reality is here in North America is we are not accustomed to raising families in condos. And particularly, if you're a young family, it's less than ideal to raise a family in a 2-bedroom condo. And that's exactly what we've been building over the last 10 years is basically small 1-bedroom units, junior 2-bedroom units way up in the sky, because that's what sells to investors on a pre-sale basis. The investors say, well, I can maximize rents on a 700 square foot 2-bedroom condo. It's harder for me to maximize rents on, a townhouse development or a duplex development, given the price points and given the rents. And so this is what basically developers have been building is high rises, expensive concrete in the sky, and they have not been building ground-oriented multifamily housing, which is built for these millennial families coming up. And so I think this is, people are asking my opinion on this and what does this all mean for the market? What I can tell you is that in the very, very near term is going to benefit landowners. Landowners are going to get an enrichment. Anytime you increase the density on the land, it essentially increases the value of the land. Again, that's in the near term. Over the longer term, over the next 5 to 10 years, the people who are going to benefit are young families as supply gets built and basically mitigates, slows price appreciation and provides more housing option, more supply. Again, at the end of the day, housing is micro. It is about supply and demand. So while the macro certainly matters in the bigger picture, on the micro level, supply and demand matters. And that's why we're seeing right now, we've talked about on the show, which is why are house prices going up today, right now? They're going up. Why are we in multiple offers when we've got mortgage rates still at 5%? We've got a potential, what seems like a looming recession coming down the pipe. And you've got banking crises emanating or expanding across not only the US, but in Europe as well. And because it's the micro that matters, which is right now, you've got new listings at 20-year lows, you've got inventory at 20-year lows. And so anytime the micro is basically overtaking the macro. And so I think this is a massive, massive policy change. One that is, I'm here in Calgary, and I can tell you, I took a single family house and converted it into 4 units. So you've got a side-by-side duplex with 2 legal basement suites. And this is pretty much legal all across Calgary. And I think this is part of the reason why, yes, Calgary has a lot of land, but it's also the zoning here is even more lax. So you got more land and even more lax zoning. And so that obviously helps mitigate price appreciation. The ironic thing is in the city of Vancouver, the majority of your land is actually zoned residential single family. And when the majority of your land is residential single family zoning and the entry level starting point just for the dirt starts at $1.7 million in the city of Vancouver, that's not very attainable. So we have this situation in the market where young families essentially have a choice. They can, if they have husband and wife, have 1 child, they are basically forced into a 2-bedroom unit, or they stretch themselves significantly and go into a 3-bedroom or 4-bedroom single family detached, which starts getting closer to $2 million. And there hasn't really been an in-between, or the missing middle, as they like to call it, because we haven't been building this housing supply because it's been basically restricted. What governments and municipalities have been actually approving is basically condos and, say high rises way up in the sky. And these high rises are catered to pre-sale investors, and the pre-sale investors want to maximize cash flows. So this is a much, much needed policy. I rarely agree with what governments do in respect to policy and housing. I think that the file has been dropped for so many years. This is one policy where I think is actually going to make a reasonable, here in Calgary, is actually one of the most popular housing types is these infill units. Basically, they're called duplexes, because, for a lot of younger people coming up that, aren't that savvy in fixing up their old house, it's either they can buy a 1950s bungalow for $750,000, or they can buy a brand new infill, the half duplex for $850,000. So yeah, they're paying a little bit more and they don't get the full piece of land, but they've got a brand new unit with a 10-year home warranty. And I can tell you the take up on that, it's a product that is in demand. And I know it's a product that's going to benefit in places across BC, and we've also seen the Toronto government this week as well announce that they are working through legislation to begin approving this type of development over there as well. So governments are finally coming around to this. Again, all I have to do is point you to, this is why, again, we talk about the micro, single family detached. There's this missing middle is so prevalent because you have all these millennial families that, again, are finally starting to grow up. And you can see months of inventory for single family detached houses right now is at 2.4 months of supply. And that's why you have prices going up, because these families have to get on with their lives and they need 3 bedrooms. They need more space. And it's hard to raise a family in these like high rise condos. And so someone is rebuttaling to me, it's expensive to build high rise concrete towers. It's very, very expensive. It's about $600 a square foot just on the building cost minimum, plus your land. You're another 500, 400, 500 square foot for the land as well. So then you add on the financing costs, the marketing costs, and it really starts to add up. So it's much actually cheaper to build this low rise ground oriented density, because you don't necessarily, you don't have to build underground parquets. You don't have to build elevators. You don't have to build using concrete. You can build using wood frames. So it's actually a cheaper form of building, and the construction cycle is much, much shorter. So I think this is, again, over the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to benefit these young families. In the very short term, anyone that's owned land will benefit, I think, quite significantly from this. Quick touch on that. The BC government also announced, again, another enrichment to the landowners currently that have single family houses, that they are going to start legalizing, making it mandatory to legalize basement suites. So they're actually going to give you a $40,000 grant to build and renovate a basement suite in your home. And I believe they forgive half of that. So if they give you up to $40,000, they will forgive, I believe, up to half of it. So basically $20,000 for free if you rent it for 5 years below market rent. So again, we'll wait to see sort of the specifics that come out. But it's interesting. Again, I think it's a policy that enriches the existing landowner. Essentially free money for them to build these suites. It will obviously, I think, support issues in the vacancy market. The one thing to keep in mind here is, given the, I think, horrendous tenancy laws in BC, where once tenants go month to month, you can actually only rent it up. You can only increase rents by 2%. So if you're below market for 5 years and you say, okay, well, my 5 years has passed, I now want to increase it to market rents. I'm wondering if you're actually going to have the ability to increase it to market rents, because under current tenancy legislation, that you can't do that. You can't just arbitrarily increase the rent to whatever you see fit. So that's something to sort of keep in mind. Well, again, we'll wait. The devil is always in the details. The last thing I'll touch on is the government also says, hey, listen, we're going to start taxing. Yes, the solution in Canada is always more taxes. We're going to start taxing these big bad property flippers, the speculators, as they like to call them, in the housing market. And so we don't know what the tax is going to look like, but my understanding is it's basically anyone that flips a home within 24 months, within 2 years, is going to pay an additional tax. So whatever the CRA is already charging you, if you've got a history of doing it, you're already charged as business income. You're already charged as business income if you have a history of flipping. Keep that in mind. But it looks like the BC government is going to come in and add, and it looks like another additional tax. But let's just quickly flip to the data. The data is, the anecdotal story is that flippers are the problem. There's these dirty speculators that are in the housing market that are responsible for increasing the valuations. I think that's a valid assertion. But when you actually look at the data, number of homes that is currently bought and resold within a 24-month period currently sits at 6.4% of the total transactions. Again, that's well below the previous peak, which was in 2007, where 16% of home sales that were bought were resold for a profit, basically within a 24-month period. Of course, we know what happened a year later in 2008. And then we had, of course, the foreign buyer boom, where we saw the number of home sales that were bought and resold in the 24-month period eclipsed just over 9%. And as of right now, we're at about 6% of the market. So really, again, we've been in a downwards trend for 2 decades in terms of the number of homes that are bought and resold within 2 years. So this is more narrative and politics than it is actual policy. But I understand it's political points for the government. Now, again, I would argue that the government is largely responsible for the conditions that we are currently facing. If you talk to a residential developer, if you look at purpose-built rental buildings, if you're trying to build a purpose-built rental apartment building in British Columbia, about 25% of your overall cost, 25% of your overall cost is actually to do with taxes, developer contributions, GST, permitting costs, etc. 25%. And so obviously that impacts your pro forma. It impacts what you can feasibly build. And again, when you start restricting rents and say, hey, inflation's running at 7%, you can only raise your rents by 2%. You kind of essentially disincentivize capital from actually building new rental housing supply, because who wants to be a developer that builds and holds and rents out apartment buildings when you're basically you're required to rent out units below the rate of inflation, and it's extremely difficult to get tenants out. So ironically, the government is actually creates a lot of the own issues that they're trying to fix. So the long story short is, from this announcement, I'm a huge fan of the upzoning, the rezoning. But I think the other two policies are a little bit dodgy. But again, we'll wait and see. The devil is always in the details. So anyways, hope that helped. Hope that brings a little bit of context, and we'll see you next week.